Good evening and welcome to From the Stacks with the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Just when you thought the Biden climate policy couldn't get any worse, after all, he's dragging us back into the Paris Climate Treaty, or agreement as he wants to call it, some members of the House of Representatives have prescribed a new suicide pill for Americans, the National Climate Emergency Act. Tonight we discuss it with the Capital Research Center's Hayden Ludwig. Get your courage up and stick with us. Welcome. I'm Cal Beisner, the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Glad to be back with you here after a few weeks away, having come down with COVID. I guess that is going to come to an awful lot of people around. It's been a tough time, and I appreciate very much the prayers of many people out there who heard about my illness. Prayers for not only me, but also for my wife. We are much improved. And hope to continue gaining strength day by day. The Lord God has been good to us. He's been merciful, and we very much appreciate your prayers. Our topic tonight is a bill pending in Congress called the National Climate Emergency Act, which was introduced back in February, and we'll be discussing that with Hayden Ludwig, who is with the Capital Research Center. Before I go into that, though, before I bring Hayden on, let me just mention to you that the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation is offering for this month, and we only have tonight and tomorrow left, a wonderful new booklet called Impacts of Climate Change, Perception and Reality by my good friend Inder M. Gotlani. Gotlani is an economist who has been in the U.S. Department of the Interior for many, many years under presidents of both parties and has just done extraordinary work. This booklet does a great job of looking at all of the measures of both human well-being and environmental quality during the period of allegedly dangerous man-made global warming. And what he shows from solid empirical data over and over again is that on every single such measure, the trend is either to improvement or at least level. No great damage, no harm coming along. This absolutely flies in the face of all the claims of the climate alarmist movement. It's the kind of thing that you want to read yourself, and I would hope that you would also want to give a copy of it to teachers at local schools, to students, to leaders in your church. And from now to the end of March, which means to midnight tomorrow, if you ask for a copy of this, we will be glad to send it to you absolutely free as our thanks when you make a donation of literally any size and request it. All you have to do is to go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, in the comments field, simply mention impacts of climate change and promo code 21-03. So that's our offer for this month. And now let's bring on our guest, Hayden Ludwig. Hayden works with the Capital Research Center in Washington, D.C. Hayden, tell us a bit about yourself and about the Capital Research Center. And thank you
Hi, Cal.
very
It's
much
good
for
to be with
joining
you.
us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. My name is Hayden Ludwig, Senior Investigative Researcher for the Capital Research Center in Washington, D.C. We're America's investigative think tank. We basically study the money flows from major foundations and donors to activists on the left. We study all sorts of different organizations, from labor unions to environmental groups to dark money activist networks. My specialty is studying environmental organizations, population control, including the history of these ideas, as well as tracing dark money. And most recently, I was actually looking at various that happened during the 2020 election, money that was involved in these things. So I wear a lot of different hats, but we're talking about climate right now. So we're talking about the National Climate Emergency Act, which is legislation that's going through Congress right now that basically promises to unleash a maelstrom of new environmental legislation to totally transform the United States economy.
Yeah, I was looking at that a little bit, and we're going to go into some depth on it in our discussion tonight. This is one of those things that's a great example of Ronald Reagan saying that the nine most feared words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Right. Well, tell us just some basic background on the National Climate Emergency Act. Who are its sponsors, and what are some of its major provisions?
Well, the most famous sponsors that everybody would know would be Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, the self-proclaimed
Mhm.
Democratic Socialist, and Senator Bernie Sanders, the other Democratic Socialist from Vermont, although there are a few dozen others, all Democrats. This is not a bipartisan bill. This is very much a Democratic Party bill. And the name emergency should be familiar because most people are familiar with the concept of a government emergency, just not with the climate. You can find the president, for instance, declaring states of emergency going back to just after the Revolutionary War. It's an old concept,
Mhm.
but it wasn't really codified into law as we know it today until 1976 under the National Emergency Act. My
Mhm.
understanding of all of this is that Congress wants to, very understandably, limit the kind of emergency powers the president has while still allowing the president to declare states of emergency. So, where has this act been used before? Well, it was used most recently with the COVID-19 outbreak by President Trump, but it was also used with the 9/11 terrorist attacks 20 years ago. In a Cold War, it was used regularly for the proliferation of biological and chemical and nuclear weapons. So it's a very commonplace thing. It's been used hundreds of times. What separates this, though, is that it's targeting the climate. What's interesting about this act, the National Climate Emergency Act, is that what it wants to do is it wants to extend National Emergency Act powers, which are very specific, to President Biden to allow him to declare the climate change, global warming, a terrible, catastrophic emergency, justifying
Yeah.
his ability to unlock all of these powers. So, what are these powers? There's about 136 statutory powers. These are things specifically defined in law. I'm not a lawyer, so I don't profess to understand all 136 of these. But when you read through them, what they do, what they build up to, is basically allowing the military, allowing the federal bureaucracy under the president's guidance to bypass traditional processes, a lot of which would have to go through Congress, which is kind of what you would expect. If there's an emergency, we don't need to take a year to solve the problem if the president can solve it in 2 weeks. So the idea is pretty clear when you think about what they're aiming to do is use these powers to get their way with climate change legislation. Ignore Congress, bypass it, no need for further debate, no need for compromise with the Republican minority. So that's basically the bill as it stands. That's what that goal seems to be.
Yeah. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said back in January, I'm quoting here, he said, "I think it might be a good idea for President Biden to declare a climate emergency. Then he can do many, many things under the emergency powers of the president that wouldn't have to go through, that he could do without legislation." So basically, the thrust of this is, let's enable the president to do things that could never get through Congress. Um, just as, for example, the idea of a cap and trade bill on carbon dioxide emissions couldn't get through the Senate back in, what was it, 2009, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore it was just abandoned. And instead, eventually, President Obama used the idea of the Paris Climate Agreement to get us into serious reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, or at least to try to get us there. This is really, it seems to me, Congress uh, just shirking its, pardon me, shirking its duty to to take the lead in shaping national policy, and then take the lumps from the voters if the voters don't like it. So this is, I think, just politics as usual in a sense. Well, so the NCEA, the National Climate Emergency Act, would actually then treat our climate policy as an aspect of the National Emergencies Act from back in 1976 was when that was first passed. Um, so what are the good and bad points of this current piece of legislation working its way in Congress? And I did
I don't
say the
know.
good and bad, so
Yeah, yeah,
try to
I
come
don't
up with
know.
both.
It's like trying to name your favorite aspect of socialism. I don't know if I could name a very good thing. Well, and the reason why is there are certain environmental policies you could try and pick out some of the brighter points on this. But what I see is, to build on your point, this is just a power grab. Okay, I'll give you an example. If you go back to the last Congress before the current one, there was actually a similar piece of legislation. It was a resolution introduced by the Democratic majority in the House, and it basically would have had Congress declare its opinion that there's a climate emergency, with about as much power as that sounds. It had no power. It wouldn't have allowed President Trump, a Republican, to have any new statutory powers to do anything about this climate emergency. So suddenly there's a Democratic president occupying the White House, and the sister bill that comes out to this one gives him, this incredible power to tackle a totally novel concept. I mean, to my knowledge, and I've researched this, there's never been a this kind of emergency applied to something involving the climate, something involving gases. I've never seen anything like that. Usually, this is what you would expect. There's a wildfire, or there's some sort of horrible threat of attack by terrorists, or something like that. Very obvious. So I don't know that I could pick out good points, but I could sure pick out the bad points. The worst thing that I can think of is that this is a way to, like I said, bypass the normal legislative process, so that if this comes to pass, presumably what could happen is President Biden's administration could suddenly come out in a week or two with its whole host of new, sweeping rules that it's going to create and enact and enforce about how we're going to save us from a climate apocalypse. And there's no way, short of bringing that to the Supreme Court, there's no way for the Congress at that point to go back and deliberate on all these things. It's already been spoken for. So there's a reason that when we deal with these incredibly sweeping powers, that we want them to be held in close check. That's kind of the point of this entire republic.
Yeah,
And in
yeah,
my experience, anything that deals with climate change, anything that deals with global warming, you're dealing with such a huge scope. You're dealing with a scope that wants to regulate your very cells. It wants to regulate the way you breathe, and also where you live, how you fly, what you eat, how many children you have. You're dealing with this huge scope. I think you want that to be out in the open. I think we want that to be deliberated by our elected representatives, and not something that a bunch of administration staffers come up with very quietly in a war room somewhere, be them Republican or Democrat. I just don't think that's the best way for a constitutional republic to continue.
yeah. Yeah, you mentioned that it's like asking what are the good things about socialism? Well, one of the good things I think about socialism is that it's full of fat targets. It's really easy. It's
A man
really
after my
easy
own
to
heart.
point out its flaws. Yeah, right. So in your article, you say the devil's in the details about the NCEA, and you list 12 of them. Let's just run down through those, um, and I'll ask you to comment briefly on each one. So the first one you mention is investing in, quote, large scale mitigation and resiliency projects, unquote. What's the matter with that?
Well, I don't know if it's so much what's the matter with that as what is that? I'm not sure. I read through the entire bill and it's pretty vague. I'm very familiar with the term mitigation and especially resiliency because you find them all sorts of left wing websites. I spent probably an unhealthy amount of time reading through left wing, especially environmental websites, and there are certain buzzwords you just come to see. Usually, what this refers to is it can mean building. You go down to like places like New Orleans and building up new dikes to stop flooding. Sure, I've seen that. If the seas rise because of global warming, it could also just mean we need to replace coal-fired power plants with renewables. I don't know. I'd like to see more specifics on that.
Okay. I often see the term mitigation related to climate change, particularly in the discussion of, which is the wiser response to climate change? Is it mitigation? That is, we try to reduce the uh, carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions that are allegedly causing dangerous warming. Or do we simply say, okay, let's accept that the warming is going to happen and let's see what we can do to adjust to it? I mean, after all, humans have adjusted to all kinds of difficulties through our history, and we're pretty good at doing that. And it does seem to me that when people can flourish anywhere from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert or the Brazilian rainforest, it doesn't make too much sense to think that a degree or two, or maybe even three, of increase in global average temperature is going to cause great problems. But if we adopt mitigation strategies, that is, strategies to limit the warming, to mitigate that warming, that cost an enormous amount to the global economy, then what that means is that we're asking people to spend their incomes on mitigation instead of on adaptation. And adaptation seems clearly through human history to have been the much more beneficial sort of response to challenges like this. Um, next point that you list in your devils in the details list is upgrading public infrastructure to expand access to clean and affordable energy, transportation, high speed broadband, and water. Uh, Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, who doesn't want those things, right? Well, okay. So when they say clean and affordable energy, really what they're talking about renewables. They're talking about solar and wind. I think it's pretty clear. They're not clean. Not if you have the proper understanding of carbon dioxide is not a pollutant, so it's a silly term to use. But more importantly, they're certainly not affordable. I think part of the crazy thing about this is that it's attempting to replace the things powering the electric grid right now. This includes things like nuclear power, coal power, oil, and natural gas. It involves replacing all of these things on a huge scale with wind and solar power. But these things are highly unreliable. So you're going to result in rolling brownouts, rolling blackouts, because you simply cannot power an electrical grid with something that does not work when the sun is not shining and when the wind is not blowing.
Yeah,
So what it's really doing is it's setting up a recipe for transforming the scape of the American economy. If you look at the things referenced in just that single bullet point, transportation, I'm going off the top of my head here, but that's something like 1/6 of all of the US emissions come from just cars, just from vehicles. So when we're talking about these things, we're talking about huge scale replacements. That would mean, I've seen this in other bills, it's not specified here. That means replacing federal vehicles with these clean, renewable vehicles, like Prius types, right, running on lithium batteries. But it also means huge subsidies for private citizens to buy these things. So it's more redistribution of money to focus on ideological aims that would totally transform what people drive and where they work and what our economy looks like and how we power
yeah,
that economy too. All for the aims of satisfying an ideology, not a pressing economic need that's out there right now.
yeah. When when I was growing up, longer ago than I would like to admit, um, I noticed over a period of about 20 years that the size of candy bars kept shrinking even while their prices were rising. I was getting less for more. And that just is, I think it's an illustration that a lot of people can understand when we make reference to electricity from wind and solar. You mentioned that the more we depend on wind and solar, which are heavily unreliable, they're intermittent sources. They don't produce when it's not windy or not sunny. Um, we're going to have rolling brownouts or rolling blackouts. In other words, we're getting less electricity, but we're paying more for it because the cost per gigawatt hour of electricity produced from wind and solar is much higher than the cost from coal and natural gas. So what I see is this legislation, if it were to pass and if it were to be implemented, would raise the costs of energy for everybody in the country. And of course, that would hurt the poor a whole lot. I mean, the very wealthy people in our country, uh, they can shrug that off. They can afford a doubling or a tripling of gas costs or electricity costs, partly because, after all, they have all that money anyway, but partly too because gas and electricity really don't constitute an enormous portion of their monthly cost of living. But for the poor around America, uh, energy costs are a very significant portion of their monthly cost of living. And they don't have the kind of flexible income that would enable them to handle a major increase in the cost of energy. Well, your next point is that this National Climate Emergency Act would focus on modernizing and retrofitting millions of homes, schools, offices, and industrial buildings to cut pollution and costs. Where the devil? Where's the devil in that detail?
Well, again, it's the scale, right? Millions of homes, millions of commercial buildings. But I've seen this elsewhere too. It's part of the new wave of, and this is maybe just one aspect of it, but it's a large aspect, what they call electrification, which of course brings me back to the 1940s and the Tennessee Valley Authority. But they mean something different than that. They mean electrification is replacing natural gas in houses with all electrical appliances. So say goodbye to
Yep.
your natural gas stove. They want you to have all electric appliances. And there's theories I've heard about why they're focusing on this. So first of all, natural gas produces very little CO2 when burned, certainly compared to something like coal or oil. So it's not a particularly quote unquote dirty substance. So it's kind of a
Right.
strange thing to be focused on. But I think really the reason they're doing this, and this is a thought I actually have from a good friend who studies these things, he points out, well, the fracking revolution that gave us so much natural gas in the last decade totally caught the environmental movement by surprise. They were
Yeah.
not expecting the United States to suddenly become virtually energy independent thanks to natural gas. And gas has always been, for the last 30 years, a difficult target for the environmental left to target because, unlike oil or coal, it's not so obviously CO2 heavy, because it's not. So
Yeah.
it's always been the thing that they advocate going to, and away from something else. So they've had to really readjust their targets. And one of the easiest ways, I assume, to get rid of all of that natural gas, a significant portion of it, would be to target people's houses, right? If you can target their
Yeah.
cars and you can target where they live and where they work, you've knocked out a significant proportion of the fossil fuel consumption in this country.
Yeah. Yeah. My wife and I live in about a 50-year-old house. It's not extremely energy efficient. We're thinking about ways that we can improve that energy efficiency. One way might be to replace all the windows with double paned thermal glass windows and very high efficiency. That might make some sense. We could do that for a somewhat reasonable cost. Another way to do it would be to tear the whole thing down and rebuild a complete replacement house out of concrete instead of wood, wood and use all the very highest tech energy efficiency, construction processes, and everything else.
Mhm.
We could do that. Now, doing either one of those would reduce our utility bills per month. But whereas the former might pay for itself over a reasonable period of time, the latter would never pay for itself. And what we're being asked is to modernize and retrofit millions of homes, schools, offices, and industrial buildings without thinking about what's the break even here. What is, when does doing this result in more benefits than harms? And I think for the most part, the benefits lag way behind the harms.
Well, I'll point out
Another,
real quickly before we go to the next point that they're not necessarily measuring in dollars too. They're measuring probably
right,
in the social cost of carbon. So it's this idea that you can, that having carbon dioxide, quote unquote, pollution, because it's not really pollution, not in a
yeah,
scientific sense. Having this pollution out there has a social cost, right? It's harming people. It's going to kill X number of people every year. It's totally ludicrous, but if you have this new measurement, you can now justify spending trillions of dollars to
yeah.
rebuild every building in America because, well, there's a social benefit to all of that instead of a fiscal benefit.
Yeah, and the very phrase social cost of carbon is prejudicial in that it presumes that the social cost of carbon is positive. That is, that it does more harm than good. Whereas there's actually a lot of good reason to think that the social cost of our carbon dioxide emissions, not just carbon, but carbon dioxide emissions, is actually negative. That is, it does more benefit than harm. Not only because we get all the benefits of the energy that comes from our burning the fossil fuels, that energy that runs everything we do from food, clothing, shelter, transportation, healthcare, education, everything else. Everything takes energy. Uh, but there's also the benefit of that added carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, making all the plants in the world grow better and raising crop yields so that food is more abundant and therefore more affordable to everybody. And of course, the poor benefit from that more than anybody else. Okay, so you made reference to our next point here, and that is that this act would have us investing in, quote, public health in preparation for and in response to increasingly extreme climatic events. Another devil in
Yeah,
the
so
detail?
right. Well, so you have to kind of break it up. So first of all, climatic events is actually a more interesting part than public health, if you ask me, because it
Yeah,
presumes that climate change is going to lead to more extreme weather, be it hot or cold. That's simply
yeah,
not true. I mean, that is scientifically proved that is not true. You could take what happened in Texas in February. All right, extremely cold fronts and extremely hot fronts happen from time to time if you give it long enough wherever you are in the world. Whether the climate is getting warmer or colder, you're going to have extreme weather. But the idea that's being pushed by a lot of journalists, right, and a lot of activists, is this idea that you have climate weirding, where years are just going to get weirder and weather's going to get stranger and it's going to get harder and harder to predict. There's going to be more Category 5 hurricanes. In reality, that's all bunk. They've shown they're actually the weather. There's fewer extreme events like Category 5 hurricanes in recent years than there were, let's say, 50 years ago when they started measuring a lot of these things.
yes,
It just
yeah,
simply isn't borne out by that. But you notice they have to justify the public health thing because it's not immediately obvious what public health threat. How is what I breathe out, carbon dioxide, and what plants breathe in order to produce the oxygen that I breathe in myself, how is that a threat to public health? Well, it's not. You have to stretch to reach these extreme climatic events in order to
yeah,
justify these kinds of public health hazards. And I
yeah,
would point out too, none of their behavior matches up with all of this. If it was true that global warming is going to cause the polar ice caps to melt and the seas to rise, then we should see that effect rippling through the economy, regardless of where the activists are. We should see that housing prices, commercial building real estate prices on the coasts should be astronomical right now and rising every day because of the cost of living in a place. It's going to be a floodplain any day now, if that's true. Instead, it's not. What we see is people want to live there, and so the prices of these places go up, right? All these rich liberals who push these ideas live on the coast. They hardly live inland. It doesn't make any, or they live in places like Chicago, which are right along the coast and inland. So it doesn't match up with the behavior, with what they claim. That's what I'm talking about. You have to be really skeptical of these grandiose claims because they almost never match up to the reality that we actually see.
Yeah, even the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has acknowledged over and over again that there has been no upward trend in either the frequency or the intensity of any kinds of extreme weather events, whether hurricanes, floods, droughts, heat waves, cold snaps, wildfires that are related to weather, anything of that that sort. There have been no upward trends in any of these. And in fact, there have been some downward trends in them. I appreciate you bringing this up because this is a perfect segue to my reminding our viewers that until midnight tomorrow night, Cornwall Alliance is offering totally free a wonderful study paper called Impacts of Climate Change, Perception and Reality by Inder Gotlani. In it, he examines empirical trends in a wide variety of different climate and weather-related phenomena and commonly accepted indicators of human and environmental well-being. And he shows that in every single instance, the actual trend is either toward improvement or just simply no change. And this is the opposite of what the climate alarmists claim. So I would love to send a free copy of this to any of you who request it. Just simply go to Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, uh, when you come to the comments field, enter impacts of climate change and promo code 21-03. And regardless of the size of your donation, which will be 100% tax deductible, by the way, we'll be glad to send a free copy of this when you make that donation. So this is a way that you can support the Cornwall Alliance. We are a nonprofit 501c3 religious, charitable, and educational organization focusing on excuse me, biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the very poor around the world, and the gospel of Jesus Christ and the biblical worldview, theology, and ethics that come along with it, and how those apply to our understanding of social and political relations. So again, I would invite you to come to Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, make a donation of literally any size, and as our thanks, we will be glad to send you a free copy of this wonderful study. Okay, so back to to the details in the National Climate Emergency Act. Hayden, you mentioned that another of them is developing and transforming the industrial base of the United States by expanding manufacturing of clean technologies, reducing industrial pollution, and prioritizing clean domestic manufacturing, along with establishing new employment programs necessary to complete this transformation. What does all that mean?
Yeah, it's an overhaul of the economy, right? It's a way to say we're going to totally transform this country's manufacturing into whatever green manufacturing is. I don't know. Does that mean manufacturing solar panels and lithium batteries? I don't know. What it basically comes down to is anything they deem to be pollutant, to be wrong. This is old. We can't have this. It doesn't depend on renewables. They can do away with. And that's what I read when I see all this. Clean domestic manufacturing sounds like a good thing. I should also point out too the domestic part. This is not the left saying America first. This is the left making a paean to labor unions. It says, and you can see it in the new employment programs necessary to complete this transformation will certainly involve a $15 minimum wage at the very least, and it'll involve labor union jobs. So this is a way
But
you're basically
Hayden,
seeing.
what is wrong with a $15 minimum wage? I mean, wouldn't it be great if everybody now making 7.25 an hour were making 15 instead?
You have to ask my labor union
You
colleague if you want
laugh.
the details on that.
Oh,
well,
come
well,
on.
look, can the economy justify a $15 minimum wage for everybody in every state, everywhere, with the same conditions? I mean, I have to laugh because I've seen bills that are like this, and that's going to apply to, by the way, people who already work for labor unions. So the trend in this country towards people being free to work where they want and have a right to work, right? And not being forced to join a labor union and pay for a political organization's advocacy that they don't necessarily themselves
Yeah.
support, like they had to 80 years ago. The trend is basically being upset by this kind of legislation. It's a way for the
Yeah. Well,
left to say, stop the death of the labor union and let's do a solid by our buddies.
yeah.
This is
Yeah.
what they used to call the blue-green alliance between these two arms of the political left.
Absolutely. And and this embedding of the $15 minimum wage into something like this, which I think you're absolutely right, the two are going to go hand in hand, is one of the cases of real hypocrisy that I see in this thing. Over and over again in this piece of legislation, they refer to justice and to equity and to equality and so on. And yet, what they are ignoring is the fact that every single study ever done of the impact of a raise in the minimum wage concludes that what it does is it disemploys low skilled workers, it prices them out of the market so that they can't have jobs, and shifts their wage, shifts their income up to higher skilled workers. And so the result is you actually harm the very people that you say you want to help with an increase in the minimum wage. I mean, after all, if these people were really serious, why don't they just say, hey, let's make a minimum wage of $75 an hour? I mean,
Right.
that's not even that's not even a fifth of what a
Well, and that's
typical
that's why I
attorney
say
gets. But
it's a bone
why
to
not
the
do that?
unions. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's why I say it's a bone to the unions. It's a way for them to basically regain ground that they've lost over the last 40 years as their
And
membership
to
has
eliminate
utterly
competition
collapsed.
for their jobs.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay, next, this act wants to ensure small business support, especially for women and minority owned businesses.
Yeah, yeah. Now we get into my favorite parts of the bill, the parts that have absolutely nothing to do with climate, or at least have a fig leaf of environmentalism behind them. Look, this is what we hear when we hear about Black Lives Matter. It's what we hear when we hear from the woke activist movement. It's all about redistribution of wealth because it's basically Marxist. And when I say that, I don't mean that they're all quoting from Das Kapital. What I mean is that they think like Marxists, the activists who support these kinds of bills.
Yeah.
They see the world as divided between oppressors and oppressed. And it used to just be that was the owners of capital, the capitalists versus the laborers, the proletariat. Now it's just black people and white people oppressing black people, or men oppressing women, right? So this is just
Or
a
heteros
way, part of
oppressing
the,
trans, or heteros oppressing homos or
that's
trans.
right.
Well, right?
That's exactly right. And so if you look at this bill, it involves moving money. I'm looking at right now, 40% of investments have to flow to historically disadvantaged communities. So there you have it. It's a way to move money to the little programs and the constituents that they want. It's really a way to reward these groups for largely for voting for President Biden in 2020, if you ask me.
Yeah. The next point in this was avoiding avoiding solutions that increase inequality or decrease union density or membership. Wow. I mean, how does that address
Yeah.
keeping the world from frying tomorrow?
Yeah, I know. It's the same thing if you read any of these, the Green New Deal too. It starts out by talking about sweeping climate's going to destroy us all, and then they get into what they really want to talk about, and it's things like this. Income inequality. What does that have to do with the climate? Well, nothing. But if you understand intersectionality, which I think we're going to talk about later tonight, if you understand
Mhm.
critical race theory, if you understand Marxist thinking, it makes perfect sense. The left has basically come up with the tools that allow it to justify any of this stuff and call it climate. Yeah, sure, we'll call it climate today, but really they could call it anything because they don't want to call it what it is. It's just socialism. It's just a way to appease particular constituent groups and move money to the places that they want to from the people they want to punish. And oh, and by the way, we're saving the planet while we're doing it. Yeah, right.
Yeah. Um, let's see. Next is creating jobs that, quote, protect the rights of workers to organize, unquote, in labor unions. I mean, you mentioned this
Yep.
before. I mean, this is a huge sop to the labor union movement, which has been losing power over the last 5 decades or so as the economy has continued to grow and make people less and less dependent on union organizers. So, uh, obviously, one critique of this point would be, so what does that have to do with climate change, which supposedly is the the major issue of this bill? Uh, but what's wrong with protecting the rights of workers to organize in labor unions?
Yeah, well, what I suspect with that particular point is it's probably actually targeting states like Tennessee, which are strong right to work states, I believe. Kentucky, I think, is another one. But many states in the
Yeah,
South where, well, you live there, you would know, right? Many states in the South where foreign auto manufacturers have moved in recent years, like Volkswagen, have moved in and started manufacturing. And because they're right to work states, you don't have to join a union to work there, basically. And it would make sense to me that that's what they're targeting. I don't know that's true for sure, because the auto industry is always a perennial target of the environmental movement for the obvious reason if they want to replace gas fueled cars, oil powered cars, right? They want to replace them with basically electric vehicles, which is why they're constantly getting federal subsidies for these technologies that can't ever seem to pay for themselves.
yeah, yeah. The next one, I think we don't need to really talk about it very long, but I just want to have the fun of reading it. This is prioritizing local and equitable hiring of, and remember, this is all about solving the climate crisis, right? I mean, we have a national climate emergency act here, right? So this is all about solving the climate crisis. So this bill would prioritize local and equitable hiring, local for global warming. Okay, local and equitable hiring of. I mean, the ironies are all through here. Hiring of communities of color and indigenous communities, women, veterans, LGBTQIA plus individuals, disabled and chronically ill individuals. Maybe I will qualify for that if my COVID uh, symptoms continue much longer. Formerly incarcerated individuals and otherwise marginalized communities. Um, if there's anything that indicates that this thing is demagoguery, that it is just simply going after various different microcosms of the population and trying to bring them on board. I think this is just that. But let's move on to the next one. Next to the last of the 12 different devil in the details points that you raised, combating environmental injustice by ensuring that affected communities have equitable access to public health resources that have been systemically denied to communities of color and indigenous communities. All right.
Yeah, not systematically, systemically, which is funny because systematically would make more sense to me. But
Yes.
oh yeah, I mean your guess is as good as mine. Medicare for all? I mean, what has been denied to communities of color and indigenous communities? It's kind of a nonsense thing, and it doesn't need to make any sense. Environmental injustice or environmental justice, that's a Marxist term. That goes to the heart of critical race theory, which is just intersectionality. All I mean by that is it's just a way for activists to capture all the social policies they want, expand Medicare to include everybody. So basically make it a single payer healthcare system is ultimately the goal, right? Or to have a $15 minimum wage, or to have federally subsidized abortions, or to have federally subsidized transsexual sex changes. I mean, whatever. They could justify anything and call it environmental because there's a history of systemic oppression of particular communities. It's all just nonsense words. None of it's meant to be specific. That's why it's so vague, because they could do whatever they want with that. I don't know what that means, frankly. I'm terrified to find out one day.
Yeah, yeah. Well, here's a bit of good news. I see from congress.gov that the bill was introduced in the House on February 5 and referred to the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management, but no further action has been taken. And of course, it hasn't yet passed in either the House or the Senate. So, what, you know, behind the scenes, are you aware? Can you tell us what's been happening with the NCEA since it was introduced? Is it actually making any headway?
All I've noticed is that it's brought on more co-sponsors. I think Ilhan Omar is one of them, a very controversial congresswoman. So no, but that doesn't mean anything. It could be 2 more months before it passes the Senate. My what I get, what my impression that I get is there's been a slew of these kinds of bills recently. There's another infrastructure bill. It's a green infrastructure bill called the Build Green Act that's been introduced in
Yes.
the last couple, I believe that was March 18th or thereabouts. So just a couple weeks
Yep.
ago. So what I see is I see the Democratic Party right now in the House and the Senate doesn't really seem to know exactly which direction it wants to go. It's got a lot of different things it's playing with, and they all seem to say almost the same thing, but they kind of fit together like puzzle pieces. My prediction is that they'll go with one of them, maybe not all of them, maybe two of them, but no more than that, because they all basically accomplish the same thing. And it's probably a lot of behind the scenes cattle trading right now, horse trading, excuse me,
Yeah.
over which particular bill they get to choose, because they all more or less say the same exact thing.
Yeah. Folks, we have just about 15 minutes left in tonight's program. And I want to just remind you that if you are watching on Facebook, you can post a comment and we'll do our best to address that for you. If you have any questions for Hayden, preferably for Hayden, not for me. Uh, I'd like to see him on the hot spot, not myself. We'd love to get your questions in front of us. Well, what really lies behind the National Climate Emergency Act is the Green New Deal, whose architect, Saikat Chakrabarti, I hope I'm pronouncing his name reasonably well, told the Washington Post back in 2019, not long after Alexandria Ocasio Cortez had introduced the Green New Deal. He said to the Washington Post, do you guys think of it, that is the Green New Deal, as a climate thing? Because we really think of it as how do you change the entire economy thing? You kind of made a little reference to that a little while ago. Can you just comment on that a bit, Hayden? How would the Green New Deal or the National Climate Emergency Act or the one that you just mentioned, the Build Green Infrastructure Jobs Act, how are these really change the entire economy thing rather than a climate thing?
Yeah, well, I take his word for it. I mean, he was the chief architect for the Green New Deal legislation 2 years ago. So I think it's a rare moment of these activists telling the truth about exactly what they really care about. When I study the environment, what I see is a lot of a gigantic fig leaf, if you will, if there is such a thing, a gigantic fig leaf of the environment, and it's all about saving the planet. But really, right behind it is a truckload of all sorts of things that have nothing to do with that whatsoever, because the priority is always sweeping changes to the economy, kind of like Obamacare was. It wasn't an environmental bill, but we see these sorts of things now put forward on a regular basis as environmental legislation. For instance, the Congress has been debating for decades an infrastructure bill. Well, now we have one, and it's a green infrastructure bill, and it says the same exact things about labor unions and a federal $15 minimum wage for all these workers and indigenous communities and communities of color. This is the same exact thing as this National Climate Emergency Act. So what I see is the people on the left have obviously discovered that environmentalism is the fastest way to get everything they really want, which I would say is socialism. I think when you add it all up, this is something that would make the
Yeah.
Soviets tickled pink. I think they look at it and be very familiar. This is what they
Tickled
want,
pink, you
and
say?
instead of what's that?
Tickled pink, you say?
Yeah, I'd say that. I got myself on that one actually. Yeah, I mean, but really though, I think this is the fastest way to get to that final destination because they're not
Yeah.
stupid. They know that if you tell the American people what we really want is we want an authoritarian or even a totalitarian government to control every part of your life, most people aren't going to vote for that, right? But if you say, well, we're all going to die if we don't get these bills passed. Well, some people will vote. Clearly, did vote for that in the last election. So that's what I see pushing through all of this. And I think when you look too at the left, you have to look at the farthest tippy tip of the left, right? Right, which these are the people who create all of these terms that we just now find out, like environmental justice. Most of us have never heard about that until probably this call, this interview. But I'm certain that that's been around the last few years in the classroom, right? In the woke environmental movement. It only just made its way into the mainstream in the last few months, and now it's in the halls of Congress in legislation. Oh, and in President Biden's office, White House. So
Yes.
these guys are the ones driving the huge campaign to push the entire country as far left as rapidly as they possibly can, so that there's never a return back to sanity.
Yeah. Yeah, which is what we have seen in pretty much every country that has really tried on socialism. It is very, very difficult. We could say it's a disease with a very high social fatality rate. You mentioned how these folks, and we've talked about this several times tonight. These folks seem to think that just simply calling something environmental or related to climate change is really a fig leaf. Ottmar Edenhofer, a German economist who was a co-chair of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said back in 2010, in the lead up to the climate summit in Cancun, he said, the climate summit in Cancun at the end of this month is not a climate conference, but one of the largest economic conferences since the Second World War. First of all, developed
Wow.
countries have basically expropriated the atmosphere of the world community. But one must say clearly that we redistribute de facto the world's wealth by climate policy. Obviously, the
Wow.
owners of coal and oil will not be enthusiastic about this. One has to free oneself from the illusion that international climate policy is environmental policy. This has, I'm still quoting here, this has almost nothing to do with environmental policy anymore, with problems such as deforestation or the ozone hole. There you have it from a co-chair
Wow.
of the UN IPCC. Similarly, Christiana Figueres, the former executive secretary, I think was her title, of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, under which the whole climate thing with the UN takes place. She once said that the Paris Agreement, as we were leading up to it back in 2015, offered us the best opportunity we have to replace the global economic order with a new order. She had in mind very clearly replacing free trade, limited government, the rule of law, entrepreneurship, capitalism with socialism, with global socialism. This, I think, is the real agenda behind all of these different groups and their movements, and it's clearly the agenda behind legislation like this. You can tell that because so many parts of it have absolutely nothing to do with the title of the legislation itself. They have everything to do with a complete restructuring of the nation, the society, the economy. So you made reference, and we're coming down to about 5 minutes left here, but you made reference to the Build Green Infrastructure Jobs Act into the Senate and the House that was introduced last week. Um, how does that relate to the National Climate Emergency Act and the Green New Deal?
Yeah, well, it's smaller in scope. If some, I think everything's smaller in scope than this. But what this new bill would aims to do is focus on curbing the use of traditional vehicles, so subsidizing people's purchase of electric vehicles. I think basically totally transforming the federal fleet of cars and trucks and that sort of thing to be electric. It also focuses a lot on electrifying the country, which I talked about earlier. It comes down to basically replacing all of your traditional appliances, especially those that are run by natural gas, with these new electric ones. What they can do then is they can basically then justify totally phasing out even natural gas, which for the longest time was the liberals' retreat from coal and oil to natural gas. They can now justify phasing that out from the country and just killing it off, which of course would leave us with what? I mean, the nightmare of trying to power an electrical grid off of wind and solar. It's
Yeah,
no serious engineer would ever propose doing that. The reason why we see these things put into policy is because it's all in service to an ideology. It's all in service to the promotion of power. I think if they didn't believe that they could accrue, unprecedented control over your life, our lives this way, they wouldn't be pursuing it. And the minute that they can have that control and it's no longer chic, it's no longer interesting, there are no longer any Greta Thunbergs left to complain about this. I think they'll drop the language, they'll drop the rhetoric. It's all, I believe it's that sinister, it's that cynical too. It's all in service to one goal, and that's power, it's control.
yeah. Yeah, in introducing the Build Green Infrastructure Jobs Act, or in commenting on it anyway, Senator Elizabeth Warren, the far left senator from Massachusetts, pardon me, said that it would create 1 million good new jobs. Now, that is a way that politicians love to talk, is about creating jobs. What they don't like to mention is that when you create jobs here, you invariably destroy jobs there, because all of these jobs compete with each other. And just as she would create 1 million good new jobs, she would also destroy plenty as well. But a more fundamental question arises for me as somebody who has studied a great deal on economics, wrote an introductory textbook on economics, and that is, what, after all, is the purpose of an economy? Is it to make jobs, or is it to make goods and services and to make them so abundantly that they become more and more affordable so that people can benefit from them? Uh, you know, every economist worth his salt understands that a job is a cost. That's why you don't go and work for free most of the time. I mean, sometimes people charitably volunteer some of their labor, but ordinarily people want to be paid to carry on a job, right? Why is that? Because work is a cost. It's the goods and services that come out of that work that are the benefit. And so creating jobs is not really the purpose of an economy. creating goods and services is the purpose of an economy. And jobs are one of the ways that an economy does that. But hey, if all we want to do is create jobs, hey, we could do that a whole lot more cheaply by just simply providing a shovel to everybody in the country and saying, okay, you go out, dig a hole and fill it back in. Dig a hole and fill it back in. We'll pay you $15 an hour, minimum wage, to just do that. If jobs themselves were the benefit, that'd be great. But jobs
Yeah,
themselves are not the benefit.
I
Jobs are the
remember
cost of obtaining a benefit. Pardon?
you remind me of, I think it's an old Milton Friedman anecdote. You probably heard it. I don't know where I heard it, somewhere, where Friedman traveled to communist China and came across a
Yeah.
group of workers who have a bunch of shovels and they're sifting dirt. And he asked, well, what are you trying to do? Well, we're trying to build a dam. Okay, well, why don't you take away the shovels and give them a dump truck? That'll make a lot more progress, right? And they say, no, 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 we have to achieve full employment as we build the dam. And he said, oh,
Right.
well, I thought the goal was to build a dam. If you just want full employment, take away the shovels.
Yeah.
I mean, to
Yeah.
your point, right? I mean, what's the priority? And I'll note too that the overlap with all of these things, right? It's you see terms like racism in it. Again? I mean, I've been saying this all night, but what does racism have to do with the environment? Nothing.
Yeah.
It's the priorities are there. If you first read a
Yeah.
lot of these bills and you listen to the press releases and talking about how great these things are, it can sound like gibberish, but it's not. These people are much more clever than that. They're not fools. They're not presenting a mouthful of nonsense. They're actually presenting you with their agenda. It's pretty naked, but it's slightly concealed behind something they think is more palatable and will sell well because, frankly, it'll scare the hell out of you and force you to support it. Otherwise, we all face the apocalypse. So they're not
Yeah.
fools. They're actually presenting you with exactly the dire future that they predict, that they foresee. If you're clever enough to look for it, if you know how to read these sorts of things.
Yeah. We have just a couple of minutes left here, but I want to just bring us to one last point here. In speaking of the Build Green Infrastructure Jobs Act, which would award grants to projects focused on implementing electric transit systems, Elizabeth Warren said it would, quote, confront the racial and economic inequality embedded in our fossil fuel economy, unquote. But Hayden, I have to ask you, uh, how many of your low income neighbors are driving Priuses and Teslas and uh, other electric vehicles? Aren't they mostly driving internal combustion vehicles, usually old
Yeah,
ones? I mean, it seems to me that really this piece of legislation would benefit the wealthy while harming the poor. And this is one more indication of its hypocrisy. What do you think?
yeah. Well, I mean, you pointed out earlier that just paying for gasoline occupies a vastly larger proportion of your average working class family's monthly budget than it does somebody who hardly drives at all, who makes $300,000 and doesn't worry about that. I would also say too, there's a ripple effect of the cost of gasoline, the cost of oil, that is, through the entire economy. When those prices go up, everything gets more expensive simply because the cost of powering things, but also the cost of driving all sorts of commodities and food to the grocery store and stocking shelves and paying people. These things are all affected by the cost of energy because energy is the master resource. And when you have a limited budget, when you only make, let's say, $30,000 a year, the cost of these things is going to matter infinitely more than if you're Nancy Pelosi and you don't have to worry about even driving yourself, let alone, scrounging to pay for gasoline. So yeah, and I also point out to some of the rich hypocrisy of ideas like climate justice. Where is the lithium for all these lithium batteries mined? Where's the cobalt mined for a lot of the high tech stuff that goes into solar panels and wind turbines? these places come from these commodities rather come from Africa. They come from the mines of poor countries in Latin America. Most of the stuff does not come here. It has to be shipped
And
here,
especially
right? Over
China,
and China
especially
as
China.
well, right? Yeah, so I mean, you have these countries, many of them that have slave labor-like conditions compared to what the United States has, that are basically underwriting, excuse me, through these commodities, our ability to basically play around with foolish ideas until we can't do that any longer.
Yeah.
It's really embarrassing when you think about it that way, that our country would entertain these silly, foolish ideas that I pray to God in 20 years will be on the dustbin of history with other pseudosciences, like phrenology and eugenics. I really hope that one day we look back and we scratch our heads that this generation was ever foolish enough to give these ideas more than 5 minutes.
Yeah, I hope so. It's kind of like my thinking, and I confess that this is probably not very realistic, but I long for the day when people will scratch their heads and look back and say about mass education in in collectivist schools, they
Mhm.
did what to their children? You know, but that's a different
I'm one of
topic.
them.
Okay, so Hayden, thank you again so much for joining us on this. Do you have some closing comments for us? What are some new targets that you're looking at with the Capital Research Center and the work that you're doing?
Well, I'm looking in a few different directions. Right now, Capital Research Center has been highly focused on an organization totally different from this one called the Center for Technology and Civic Life, CTCL. You
Mm,
might have heard about it because it spent $350 million in the 2020 election, all of which came from Facebook founder and billionaire Mark Zuckerberg. So we're publishing the last of our, I believe, 9 state reports looking at how that money was funneled to county and city elections officials. The one we finished right now actually is going up on our website, I believe tonight or tomorrow, is on
yeah,
Texas, where we managed to find almost $34 million. And we've traced how that affected the outcome of the election. And I'll just say that for all their claims that it was nonpartisan, I see partisanship all over the outcome for these things.
yeah,
That's one thing we're looking at. Another thing we're looking at is kind of memorializing, as you could say, because we're almost done with this thing. Sadly, the war on coal that's going on right now. Um,
yeah,
Looking over the last 2 decades, how big big oil and gas companies like ExxonMobil and Suncor and these kinds of big companies have allied themselves with major environmental activist groups like Greenpeace and Sierra Club to create this kind of unholy alliance to kill off
yeah.
coal, which is one of the most important resources we have. It's much more than just a form of energy. It's how we produce steel. It's used in more things than you could know. I just finished a series on that that's going up on our website over the next couple of weeks. So we're looking in a few different directions, trying to
Yeah.
expose the truth wherever it's hidden in the shadows.
Well, thank you very much, Hayden. And I really admire the work of the Capital Research Center. I hope that all of our viewers will go to capitalresearchcenter.org and learn more about your work there. I've read several of the different pieces in that series that you just mentioned. They are outstanding work, as always. And you're so right to think of this unholy alliance of oil and natural gas with the environmentalists against coal. And what's so tragic, though there may be some poetic justice here, is that the oil and gas companies are simply laying the foundation for their own destruction
Yeah.
by the way they have argued against coal. Because ultimately, the climate alarmists are not going to be satisfied as long as we are using any energy source that has carbon dioxide as a byproduct. That's just the case, and it's really sad to see that they've been uh, dragged into this. But again, thank you very much, uh, Hayden, for joining us this evening. Folks, our guest next week is going to be Mark Mathis with the Clear Energy Alliance. We'll be discussing a new video that he has just recently released all about the subsidies to renewables versus subsidies to fossil fuels. It's a common claim by supporters of wind and solar that fossil fuels get much bigger subsidies than wind and solar. Uh, Mark Mathis and others have done the deep digging to find the actual data on this. The facts are quite the opposite, especially when you look at the amount of subsidy per unit of energy actually produced. Mark is a former TV news anchor, long history in that. Great speaker, great thinker, and I hope that you will join us for that program next week on From the Stacks. Meanwhile, I hope that you'll also take the opportunity to go to cornwallalliance.org so that you can request a free copy of the study Impacts of Climate Change, Perception and Reality. This is by Inder Gotlani, a wonderful economist from actually in the Department of the Interior. And this looks at all kinds of different measures of environmental quality and human well-being, and shows from hard data, from solid sources, that in every instance, the actual state of affairs has been either holding steady or improving, not deteriorating. This is a tremendous study. I hope that you'll request it. Go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button. As you fill out the donation form, when you get to the comments field, just ask for impacts of climate change and mention promo code 21-03. And regardless of the size of your donation, which will be 100% tax deductible, by the way, if you request this, we'll send you a free copy of it. It's a great thing to share with students, with teachers, with church leaders, with local political leaders, and so on. So please avail yourself of that opportunity. Thanks again for joining us tonight. Many thanks again to Hayden Ludwig of the Capital Research Center, and we'll see you next week.